trickling in probably over the next half hour. I've heard from several people that are coming as soon as they can, kind of thing. So just bear with us as people come in. Tonight, we have the pleasure of having Lowell here. The faculty and staff just got to spend some time with them, and I'm so eager that I get to keep going and hear more. So I hope you all enjoy it as much as we have so far. At the end, I think there'll be a time to really engage you with questions and answers. So Lowell, welcome.
Thank you. I didn't know that Waldorf schools were filled with teachers who just love punishment and keep coming back for more. We spent an hour and a half together, and we're still here. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm a big fan of Waldorf education. I've visited in the past 15 years, I think, about 9 Waldorf schools to talk about technology and children, which is my passion. I've spent probably 30 years researching, collecting data, reading as much as I can, talking with people about that relationship. I've come up with basically 2 real solid things that I know. One of them is that I still don't know very much about that relationship. And I actually think that we ought to be pretty skeptical of anybody who says they really understand what that relationship is. Children alone are very complex subjects, and when you throw technology on top of that, it can be just mind-boggling, all of the different aspects that you have to deal with. The second thing that I know for sure from experience is that anytime I start trotting out all of this research and data to people, that there seems to be a direct, strong correlation between all of that data that I trot out and the amount of snoring that goes on in the audience. So I'm not going to bring out all this data and just lay it on you and say, look at this research study and this research study and this research study. I'm going to try to get at this in a different way. I'm going to try to rely mostly on stories. And stories, a lot of them from my experience, some from other people's experience, and then blend in a little bit of the data along the way. In fact, I'm going to start with the story. And it has to do with a group of students that I had in one of my classes at Wittenberg University, where I taught for quite some time. These students were in a media studies course that I taught frequently there. They were first-year students, bright-eyed, eager, a little scared. And so the very first day I wanted to make sure that I got their attention, and I wanted to disabuse them of this idea that so many young people bring with them, that technology is neutral, that it is something that we use as we see fit, and the only good things and bad things about it are the way that we use it. And so what I did was I showed them this slide. In fact, it's exactly the same slide that I showed them. That says, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I thought that would get them thinking about this idea a little bit. And sure enough, they did a pretty good job of figuring out what that means, right? That when you have a tool in your hand, you start thinking differently. It influences us, just like I think Jason Euler, who's a philosopher, said that technology is nothing but an idea with clothes on. Ideas are built into technologies, into our tools. And so this kind of got at that idea. They bought into it. So we tried a few more. To a photographer with a camera, everything looks like a picture, right? And then I decided, or I had it set up this way, that they would start doing some of this themselves instead of me providing the whole sentence. So I said, to a 4-year-old with a crayon, everything looks like, and then I have them complete the sentence. I have an artist in my family. My oldest son is an artist, and I can tell you from experience that all of our Hallways were nothing but murals waiting to be painted, right? So after we got them through a couple more of those that I won't put up there, I hit them with the one that I really was interested in myself. And I wanted to get what they would think, what they would say about it. And that was this one. To a teenager with a cell phone. And I said, now don't start just throwing things out like you have with the other things. I want you to take the liberty of finishing this sentence in any way you want. You don't have to follow the form, but I want you to write it down so that your ideas don't influence the ideas of the students. Okay? They did that. And I told them that when they got it done, it was about 5 minutes. It took them for everybody to get this done. I said, I want you to start coming up here, just volunteer, come up here and start writing down what you wrote on the board. And we got 4 of them done before anybody made any comments, anything happened in the classroom. And those 4 were these. Everything is connected. You always feel safe. You never have to feel lonely. And you can overcome boredom. Pretty positive stuff, right? Nobody made any comments about it. They just wrote them down. And then a student wrote this. I feel complete. Now, at that point, one of the students made a comment that I can't remember exactly, but it was a comment that basically said, I don't think that's such a good thing, right? And as soon as that comment was made, another student rushed up to the board and wrote this up there. I feel naked without it. And at that point, all hell broke loose. Because people thought, that's really a bad thing if you feel naked without it. And so the conversation started. No more things were written on the board, but the kids started saying other things that they had written down and sharing it with the class. And they were uniformly critical. I wrote down a number of them, and here are the ones that I was able to get down on my paper. Everything is somewhere else. You care more about the future than the present. Surroundings don't matter. And then this one. You are in a portable prison of immediate contactability and connection. Obviously, a student trying to butter up his professor. Right? But interestingly enough, the word prison really touched off something in the hearts of these kids. Because the rest of the time that we discussed about, that we had a discussion about this, was all about their frustration and even anger about being so tied to these devices that they couldn't give them up, that they just couldn't bear to be without them. And they were even surprised themselves at how critical they were and how much emotionally they were upset about this because they hadn't tapped into that before. I finally asked them, well, when do you get away from these things? When do you turn these devices off? And only 2 people in the class said that they ever turned them off. Only 2 students in that whole class of about 25 kids said that they ever turned their cell phones off. Why? Because it's their lifeline to their social group. Without that cell phone, they're scared that they're going to be left out, that life is going to pass them by, that their life is going to be ruined, they won't be able to be part of the group that they're invested in. Now, there's more to this story, but the point I'm trying to make here isn't so much to bash cell phones. What I really want to get across is that in this situation, these kids are displaying something that I think that a lot of us display. And that is an inability to really articulate our negative feelings towards technology. It started out with a whole bunch of kids very willingly writing about the good things, but very few of them being willing to share the critical things until someone or a couple of kids gradually brought it about. Now, I think the reason for this is pretty simple, that we live in a society where the fundamental story that we hear over and over and over again from all kinds of sources, but particularly through the media, is that regardless of any problems that technology might bring to us, we can't do anything about it. Technology is in the driver's seat. It's running our lives. And the only thing we can do is make sure we stay on board, because if we get off, we're going to be left behind. And so we have to, at the very least, accept the inevitable, or at best, think about it in good terms, and just kind of hold down, press down our negative reactions and criticisms of it. Now, if you think I'm pushing this a little too far, I want to tell another quick story. Actually, I'm not going to tell the story. I'm going to let the real masters of short storytelling tell this one, TV advertisers. What I'm going to show you now is an advertisement. You've probably seen it. It was put on TV a lot, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And I want you to pay attention to the lessons that are being taught in this advertisement, because that's what advertisements do, right? They teach us lessons about what's missing in our life, mostly, right? Well, in this particular one, the lessons are about the relationship between technology, children, and school, just what we're talking about here. So pay close attention. The lessons come fast. It's only 30 seconds long. Uh-oh. That happened last time with the teachers. Let me see if I can get back to it and do it again.
Okay, class, our special guest is here, Ellen Page. We're going on a trip to China! Wow! When I was a kid, we would just go to the farm. No, seriously, where are you guys going? The new classroom. See it, live it, share it on the Human Network. Cisco.
Okay, that's it. Now, there are a lot of lessons in there, right? The little snippets of scenes. I made a mistake one time when I was presenting this, of showing this video and asking the audience to tell me the lessons that this was trying to teach us, and I completely lost control of the audience. So I'm not going to do that tonight. Instead, what I'm going to do is just tell you a couple of them, concentrate on a couple of them, and then tell you what I think the major message is here. First of all, there's a lesson about the role of the teacher, right? Where is the teacher in this? Off to the side, basically marginalized, not really involved. Kids do the work themselves. So no longer is the teacher at the heart of the classroom in this kind of an environment. The second thing that I think is worth pointing out is the role of first-hand experience here, depicted in the scene with the cow, right? So what's that lesson? That first-hand experience is scary. It's probably physically uncomfortable. There's a reason she was wearing a jacket there that looked really cold. And it's probably irrelevant. I mean, who needs to learn about cows these days anyway? What we really need to learn about is China. And we can learn about China through Cisco. That's the lesson, right? Through technology. Now, there's also an overall message, and that's what I really want to concentrate on. The overall message here is the same message that we get day in and day out in a variety of ways about a whole variety of technologies, tools, whether it's pills or cars or anything else. And that, as it relates to children, is basically that our children's future well-being hinges on our providing them with ever more powerful tools. That's really the message that they want to get across. And we get that so often that it eventually starts to soak in to all of us. And as it soaks in, it sort of represses or pushes down those critical elements of our thinking that we rely on for so many other things to help us make decisions. Eventually to the point that our society as a whole, not anyone individually necessarily, but our society as a whole does very little critical thinking about technological development. We complain about it sometimes, but we don't do much in the way of critical analysis. Now, what I want to talk about tonight are the big omissions in this story of technology. And there are some big ones. I'm going to concentrate on three. The first one is actually one that I think most of you are probably pretty aware of, and that is technology works with children differently than it does with adults. It's not the same for children. And it's not the same for children because what technology actually does for us is extend our human capacities and amplify our human capacities. A hammer in my hand amplifies my strength in my arm. A microphone is going to amplify and extend the reach of my voice, right? A bicycle amplifies the power in my lungs. That's what tools do for us. Now, for us adults, that's just great. And we use them without having to really do much thinking about it because we've developed all of these qualities, probably to a great extent, if not their full extent, but to the extent we need them. Children is different. Children are in the process of developing all kinds of inner capacities. And the great danger of technology, any technology, is that it will not simply expand and amplify those inner qualities, but they'll replace them. They'll simply take their place and do the work for the child. Two very simple, easy to understand examples of this are the calculator and the spell checker, right? Where a technology is used and the inner qualities, inner capacities of the child are sacrificed for external power. We use a calculator instead of learning how to add, subtract, multiply, divide, and all these other things, right? We use a spell checker instead of learning to spell. Now, for us adults who have already learned to spell, fine. But for children who haven't learned to spell, that can be pretty devastating in terms of decreasing their ability to actually develop the inner resources they need. Now, we can talk about other kinds of tools that do the same thing, but I want to get on to the second way, the big omission that is in this video. And that second one is, I think, a lot more significant even than the one we just talked about. It's a story about children and childhood that we've been ignoring now for about 60 years. And I don't hear hardly anyone talking about this. And that is that up until about 1950, before television started invading our homes, nearly all of the learning that a child experienced was through firsthand experience. Didn't have any other way to learn, except reading, eventually, right? That's the exception. And we can think of the development of schools, basically starting in the 17th century or 18th century for this country, as actually a reaction to the inability of the world at large to provide the kinds of learning experiences that were required to understand symbols, like for reading, for mathematics, and so forth, right? So schools come along because they fill a gap where kids can't learn from firsthand experience, so they have to go to school to learn about symbols. After 1950, that all got flipped around. Within 2 generations, the vast majority of children's experiences in the world came to them through symbolic representations, mostly through screens. And the amount of time that children spent learning from firsthand experience dropped dramatically. Now, if you think that's, again, overstating the case, let me point out that in 2015, the last time a survey was taken, the number of hours that the average child in the United States spent per day in front of a screen was 9 hours. 9 hours looking into screens for children. If you add in, say, 8 hours, 7 hours of sleep, what does that leave you for the rest of the time for the children to have these firsthand experiences? Not much. Now, what does this mean? And why is it significant at all? Well, first of all, it indicates to us that our attitudes have changed. Because back before 1950, if a kid spent too much time consuming symbols, basically by reading a book, what happened? They got called a bookworm and they were sent outside as a solution, right? Not anymore. That's not the way we understand learning. The second thing that we have to talk about, I think I can only really get at through a quick demonstration. And for that, I brought along some of my friends. Now, some of you react to this a little bit, some of you smile, some of you beat me a little bit. But I would say that most of you adults in here have at some time or another experienced what I'm experiencing right now in my hand, right? Because this little guy's starting to move. He's warming up. He's starting to feel my hands warming him up, and he's starting to get active. You've done this before, right? If you haven't, I'm more than willing to allow you to have that experience. I suspect that not only did you feel something when you saw this little guy, but there are a few memories that came back to you as well. And a few associations. Maybe going fishing, maybe getting chased by your older brother or sister in the backyard, digging in the soil, right? Lots of different things come to mind. How does that happen in your mind? Well, we have these things that neuroscientists call schema that are created whenever you have this firsthand kind of experience. And that schema then sits there like a hook. And then similar experiences are hooked onto that schema. So that when you find something that is like this, you have a recognition and all kinds of meaning, emotions, memories come flooding back to you. That's how our mind handles things like this. A kid who has lots and lots and lots of firsthand experiences will have lots of schema in there for all kinds of other kinds of even unique experiences to hook onto because they can find some kind of similarity between them. Does that make sense? Okay. So the question that we have to ask then, oh boy. Oh, thank you. My wife comes to the rescue. So the question that we have to ask is, when you have children spending 9 hours a day looking into screens, consuming nothing but symbolic representations, because that's all that screens can actually produce, is symbolic representations of other things. What does it mean then that they consume probably hundreds of thousands of these symbols a day that are not connected to any kind of actual experience they've had themselves? That's a really important question for educators and for parents. And we actually know some things about this. Not everything, but we know some things from a lot of neuroscience work over the past few decades. First thing that happens, and this is, I think, common sense. Kids get it wrong. They misrepresent the things that they see on the screen. They don't understand things quite right. The second thing is they don't comprehend at all. They simply don't comprehend what their eyes actually see. And you can see this, I can explain this a little bit by just showing this word up here. It's a symbolic representation of Nightcrawler, right? Of what I just showed you. Those little squiggly lines that represent letters and words have no meaning in and of themselves. They draw their meaning only from those objects right there. And if a child comes across words like this, and they have never encountered anything that's remotely similar to a Nightcrawler in their real life, they don't make any sense of it. And so what we're getting now at the last level of education I worked in, higher education, is a lot of kids coming into school who are really, really good at language arts. They can write great sentences. They can read any text that you give them and get all the words right, and they don't understand any. And we've been wrestling with this now at higher education. What do you do with kids with all the skills, but none of the ability up here to comprehend it? It's because we're feeding them symbols that aren't attached to anything. And so they can't make any meaning out of it. That's the second thing that happens. The third thing that happens is, and there's a lot of research for this just in the past decade, that intelligence, the ability to think, is firmly grounded in our emotional lives. That emotions are the basis for intelligence. If we are not connected with things emotionally, we don't remember them, we don't think about them, we don't analyze them, we simply don't engage them. And in any way like we do if we're emotionally invested in it. And so a child who has no experience with the real world things like a Nightcrawler simply doesn't care when they encounter a symbolic representation. They can't generate any kind of interest in it. And so again, at the end of the educational spectrum, we encounter kids who come to the university, and even if they can comprehend a little bit, they really don't care about what they're doing. And I think in high school this is a problem. I think even in middle school it's a problem. Kids simply don't care about the kinds of things they read, the kinds of things they see, because there's no emotional involvement. Now, the last thing, and this is just new research, because it's really a new thing, and it's new because of the tremendous amount of symbolic representations that kids are getting these days. And that is that kids have begun taking symbols, what they see on the screen, as the actual real thing. That's the experience, is what they see on the screen. It's not representing anything at all. They've stopped associating what they see in the symbols with something else. They just take what they see as the experience. Sherry Turkle, who's a psychiatrist at MIT, she's been studying children and computers for decades, says that, refers to this as taking things at interface value, right? Instead of face value, interface value. And there's a lot of concern about that, simply because what you see on the screen is not the fullness, doesn't have the fullness of what the real experience has. Now, again, I'm speaking about this as if this is a blanket statement and we all suffer from this, or all of our kids suffer from this. I don't mean that. But what I do mean is that it's a growing problem. And to give you an idea of how that problem is growing, let me just point this out. Here's an article from 1995, a long time ago now. It was in the Des Moines Register. I was teaching in Des Moines at the time, and it has captured my attention because it says students visit Africa. And of course, the word visit used to mean that you actually went there, right? But this says without leaving home. So obviously, it has something to do with the internet or whatever it is that they were doing. Well, it turns out what they were doing was they were engaging a guy who was traveling across the Rift Valley in California, in Africa, who would get to the end of his journey, and he would get linked up with satellite, and he would pipe his camera feed through that feed into classrooms all around the United States. And so the kids could watch him. He would pan the camera, show them everything that's going on, talk about what he'd experienced through the day. Okay, that's fine. But at the end of this article is what really caught my attention. It says, Justin Young, a Johnson Middle School student, was excited to see firsthand what was happening in Africa. Now, what's the key word there? Firsthand, right? We've begun adjusting our language to suit the way that we experience the world through screens. This isn't a kid saying this. This is the reporter. And he's now beginning to tell us that we can have firsthand experiences through watching things on a screen. Let me give you one more example of this, because I want you to see how this has progressed over time. That first one was in 1995, the first time I encountered this kind of thing. This one comes from 2008, I believe. It's a promotional video for a restaurant chain. And I want you to pay attention to the way the guy describes what children can do at this restaurant. And see if you pick up the point I'm trying to make here.
We have 26 rainforest cafes across the country. We're part of Landing's Restaurant Group out of Houston, Texas. We have casual restaurant themes, ranging from our flagship store of Joe's Crab Shack to our newest concept, T-Rex, which is currently being opened in Kansas City, Kansas. Your children can get up and walk around and see all the different animals, where they're actually able to see a rainforest for the first time and what a real rainforest looks like, rather than just in a book. They're actually able to experience and to touch and to see, to actually smell, between the rain going on behind me and everything else, to actually feel a rainforest. And they're actually able to learn a little bit while they're actually dining. I mean, it's a true dining experience. They can go to see the crocodile and the gorillas, everything else.
So you see how things have changed over that period of time, right? Now this is a simulation. It's not actually a screen symbolic representation, but simulations are in fact symbolic representations in a different form. But they're always symbolizing something else that's the actual experience, right? Now, I gotta tell you, I lived in Ecuador for 3 years, and I spent a lot of time in the rainforest. And when he says that they could smell the rainforest, he's lying. Because in the rainforest, everything that isn't growing is rotting, and no one wants to eat in an environment that smells like that, right? So he gets it wrong. He just simply gets it wrong. He doesn't comprehend, right? But this is what's happening. We have such vivid representations of reality on our screens and through robotics and all this stuff now, that we tend to start thinking that what we see in those representations are the real thing. And that's what our children learn. Now, I'm not going to say there's no place for simulations. There are a lot of places where simulations work. And I'm not saying that you should grab your child and go down to Florida so that they can pet an alligator down there, right? That's not the point at all. The point is that we can't just simply accept the idea that people start to talk about simulations and what they see on the screen as the real thing, as the first-hand experience, as what they judge their experiences in life to be all about. It doesn't work because there's so much missing from any of those kinds of experiences. Now, what's missing? I think the thing that we really ought to recognize is that the piece that's missing for children, particularly, is the living relationship that happens between a child and the object that they're encountering. And this is where you can really see the difference between the way that we learn through symbols and the way we learn through real life. You can learn everything that has ever been written practically about trees by just getting on the internet, right? You can study all this stuff, get all kinds of information about trees from the internet. But there's a huge qualitative difference between that kind of learning and actually going out and peeling the bark from a tree, feeling the difference between being in the shade and being out in the sun, crumbling the leaves in your fingers, climbing the tree, all of those kinds of experiences that come with actually engaging that tree. The first Earth Day that we had, how long ago was that? Long time ago. There was a decision made that we needed to educate our kids about the environment. 20 years later, it was declared a complete failure. And the reason that it was, after they talked to a lot of environmentalists, they asked, why was it such a complete failure that we couldn't educate our kids about the environment in the way that we did it? And the conclusion that they came to was because we kept showing them the rainforest burning down. We kept showing them all of these things that were so remote from their own experience that just didn't have any claim on these kids. And what the real environmentalists told policymakers was, you've got to do a different campaign. And what's the campaign they came up with? If you want to save the rainforest, teach a kid to love a tree. Right? That's the knowledge that I'm talking about. That's the kind of difference that I'm talking about. If you look at this, you can't see it real well, but you can see that little boy that's in that tree. He's my oldest son. This is a long, long time ago. That smile conveys confidence, competence, overcoming risks, pride in the fact that he could get up there, right? Now, his dad, who's taking the picture, has terror written all over his face because I thought he might fall. But you see what the difference is. You aren't going to get that kind of experience by going on the internet and Googling trees. It's an entirely different learning experience. So, having gone through all of that, let me just rely on some other commentators. Gregory Bateson, who's a cultural anthropologist, once wrote that that the problem with simulations is that it's very much like eating the menu instead of reading. I think that's a good thing to keep in mind, right? There's nothing nutritious about eating a menu. And then he says, this is a little bit tougher, a little harder to get your head wrapped around. Nobody prays over a menu. Simulations, symbolic representations cannot elicit on their own feelings of reverence, compassion, love, all of those kinds of things that we really want our kids to learn about or learn from, right? To find things they can learn that from is difficult anytime. It's impossible to learn that through symbolic representations, pictures, and text. You have to engage in a living relationship with the world in order to do that. Now, what all of this is basically saying, I think, is that technology has been a big blessing to us in the fact that it's given us a tremendous amount of power over the world. And we've benefited from it in so many, just countless ways. And I don't want to, deny that. I'm not a Luddite. I'm not somebody who wants us all to go live in a cave somewhere. But what we have to really keep in mind is that it's done this by putting more and more distance between us and that world. Every time we pick up a tool, we put distance between us and that which we encounter. And the more powerful the technology is, the more distance that we put. And I don't mean necessarily physical distance, I mean psychological distance. Our connection with those things retreats as we use more and more technological power over our environment. And I'm convinced that what we've actually done is really harmful in that respect because we haven't thought about it. Max Frisch, who's a German playwright, wrote that we ought to think about technology as the process by which we rearrange the world so we don't experience it. Think about that for a minute. Now, my dad, who's not a philosopher, he's a farmer, said something similar to that, without intending to, I'm sure. When he was in his 80s, I asked him about, his life as a farmer and all the transitions he went through in that life. And he said, I really loved farming with tractors because it's so much easier than farming with horses. But I thought I was a lot better farmer. And I was more of a farmer, and I enjoyed farming more with horses. And the reason? Because when I was farming with horses, my feet were always on the ground. And the ground is what a farmer is all about, right? Now, he could have said it in a different way. That farming with a tractor put him so far up above the ground that he lost contact with what was really meaningful to him. The connection was much more difficult to hold on to on a tractor than walking behind horses. So what we really, I think, need to understand about all of this is that while technology extends our reach, it actually quite easily numbs our senses and our sensibilities in the process. Now, that's a big problem for children. It's a problem for all of us, but it's a big problem for children. Because, again, they're in the process of developing all kinds of their senses and sensibilities. And we don't want to numb them. Now, let me put that in historical perspective for you. Over the last 300 years, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, what we've been doing is using technology to steadily increase human power over the environment. But in doing so, we've increasingly, because of this numbingness that comes from distancing us from that which we're working with, we've alienated ourselves from that environment, from the natural world. And I'm convinced that much of the reason that we have the environmental mess that we have now is because of that numbness that has come about towards nature through our use of technology to basically exploit it. Now, the reason that I bring this up, and the reason that I want to state that, is because if the industrial, the physical tools did that to our relationship with nature, what can we say about what's happened now that we're starting to work with mental tools? And I have to tell you that even though I'm sure that all of the consequences of our use of mental and social tools that we're engaged in now, we aren't going to know what all of those consequences are for a long time yet. But all the evidence that I've been able to scrounge around and find indicates that we are probably having the same kind of alienating process going on in our social relationships brought on by social media, that the physical tools that we used did to our relationship with nature during the Industrial Revolution. The same things happening through Facebook, through all these social media. You look at what is happening to our children now that we've had social media around for a while, and it's not a pretty sight. And I think one of the ways that I can help you with that is actually cite some of the results of the research. Loneliness and alienation. Self-reporting of loneliness and alienation has been on a long upward trend for several decades now. Capacity for empathy has declined dramatically over the past 2 decades in the United States. By 2010, even though Facebook was reporting that their average user had 130 friends, right? 1 in 4 Americans said that they had no one in the whole world that they could confide in. There are lots of other things that I could cite about the deterioration of our connections with other people in a time when we seem to be connected with everyone. But the fact of the matter is, being connected is not the same as being close. And being close to each other requires something other than some kind of high-tech interface that runs out to who knows where. So, let's get on to what we're going to do about this. All right? You think I have the answers? No, I don't. I wish I did. I wish it was as simple as just keeping all of this stuff away from our kids, right? That it would be nice to be able to say, okay, just stop the kids from having access to all of this, all these screens, and we'll be okay. But it's not working that way. We've been doing this long enough now that we have rearranged our social and physical environment to the point that if we took, and it's been rearranged to accommodate all of this stuff, right? To the point that now, if we took all of these devices away from our children, we'd be leaving them basically in a social, cultural, and even physical wasteland. It's not the same world that I grew up in, where my mom would say, you've been inside reading long enough, get outside. And she'd be happy that I was safe and doing things with sticks and string and all that kind of stuff, and I was going to learn a lot just by being outside. We don't have that kind of world anymore. I mean, Colorado's about as good as you get, but even here, It's difficult for children to find the same kinds of ways of connecting with nature and people that we had to do it years ago. And so, we can't go that way anymore. We can find oases where all of this kind of thing is better. And I gotta tell you, in all of my experiences, in all of the schools that I've been in 30 years as an educator, Waldorf School is the best environment I've found for this, as an oasis. I'm absolutely convinced that Waldorf Schools represents one of the best places you can put your kids in a way that compensates for what I've just been saying. And nobody paid me to say that. But that's an institution, right? Institutions can do these kinds of things a lot better than families can, because they can kind of isolate the kids. You can't isolate your kids entirely at home. You just can't get away with that. And so for you, basically the options would be to kind of join an Amish community or something, right? And even the Amish are having trouble with this, right? So this is not something that we can just find a simple solution and make a decision and it's all over with. So what I'm going to do is basically offer you a few suggestions that could help. Not solve the problem, but might be able to help. What I see it as sort of a thermostatic effort. We'll turn the thermostat down a little bit, cool off the technology a little bit, without trying to turn it off entirely, because that's a hopeless task at this point. So let me do it in two ways. First, I'm going to show you some guidelines, and then more practical solutions, which is what you really want to hear about, I'm sure. Let's begin with a project that I helped work on starting in the year 2000. I helped found an organization called Alliance for Childhood. The idea was that we were going to get all the organizations that were concerned about children and individuals, doctors, anybody who was involved with children's lives, and see if we could coordinate a way to protect childhood. Because we were all convinced that childhood is disappearing, and I still think that's true. That the things that made up childhood as it was known 100 years ago, 50 years ago, have been disappearing at a rapid rate, and we wanted to protect it. The first project we undertook was to address the issue of technology in children's lives. And we knew that it would do no good at all to say, stop. Don't let the kids have the stuff. People wouldn't listen to that on a wide scale. So what we did was work the other way. We said, maybe we can come up with enough things that kids ought to be doing that there wouldn't be time for them to be involved in all these other kinds of technological activities. And in fact, I think that's one of the strategies that works. But the other part of it is, there are a whole lot of things children ought to be doing if we're going to prepare them to live in a technological world. And that's what these childhood essentials are really about. How do we prepare a child to live in a high-tech world? The first thing, pretty obvious, close, loving relationships with responsible adults. We don't get enough of it. It's not about quality time, it's about time. And about the love that we show for our kids. Outdoor activities, nature, exploration, gardening, other direct encounters with nature, absolutely essential. In part because it helps a child understand the difference between life and machine. And that's a crucial element in coming to terms and understanding how to live in a technological society. You have to know that life is not the same as artificial intelligence. That living beings have other things, needs, aspirations, ways of living than machines do. Time for active creative play is part of the core curriculum for young children. Lions for Childhood now, I'm not a part of it anymore. They are totally dedicated to reviving play in the United States. 50 years ago, when I was a child, the average child knew, I believe I get this right, 15 nursery rhymes and somewhere in the 20s of games that you could play without any object whatsoever, like hopscotch and so forth. The last time I've heard a survey taking of what child activities are, the number of nursery rhymes is on average down to 1. You're lucky if you can find a kid who actually knows a nursery rhyme. And the number of activities that don't require an object to play with, 3. Average is 3. These kinds of play is rapidly disappearing, particularly play that is child-directed. I mean, still, we play with video games, right? But it's not child-directed play. And that child-directedness is the key element, because that's how kids learn how to use their imagination, to develop ideas for how they engage the world. Music, drama, puppetry, dancing, painting, all of these. I don't think I need to go through the whole statement there. Hands-on lessons, handcrafts, other physically engaging activities, which literally embody the most effective first lessons for children. From the hand to the heart to the mind, right? I think that's something that you hear a lot. A neuroscientist wrote a book about 10 years ago called The Hand, in which he did brain scans, spent years doing this, taking children and adults, every kind of person he could find, and had them do activities with their hands. And then he had them read, and he had them do other activities. And what he found was that as soon as a human being engages something with their hands, firecrackers go off in the brain. Nothing turns the brain on like taking a hold of something with your hands. So handcrafts, working with your hands, is an absolutely essential part of developing the brain. It is neuroscience, I guess. Rich language experiences, including, and I want to make sure I say the storytelling and books read aloud with beloved adults. My sister ran reading recovery for Des Moines Public Schools for 25 years. And it's if kids can't read by 3rd grade, they go into reading recovery. And their job is to find a way to bring them up to speed. She told me that she had attended a lecture where researchers just kept trotting out onto the stage. And basically their message was, the single most important predictor of whether a child will be an avid reader has nothing to do with what you teach them. It has everything to do with whether their parents read to them when they're young, before they know how to read. So that's why this is here. The last one. Time and space for children to create meaning and experience a sense of the sacred. Now, we added this a little later because some folks on the Alliance were a little worried about the word sacred being used. People get nervous when you throw that in there. But we meant it in the broadest sense possible, and I'll give you a quick story to kind of give you a sense of what we mean by this. I had a mentor who was still a really important person to me before I ever started teaching, who told me to ignore what my professor said and what my principal would tell me about the importance of keeping kids on task. He said, you're going to run into kids who daydream. And he said, don't you dare interrupt that daydream. There's really important work going on behind those glazed eyes. And they have gone to a place where you should not enter. It's a sacred place. And so I remembered that throughout my teaching career. And, you know, I imagine a lot of kids were thinking about their girlfriend or whatever. But I know that there were a lot of kids who were doing really important work. That they were sitting there, they weren't just sleeping. They were trying to find a way to respond to all of the cruel things that happened to them, all of the things that went on in their lives that was attacking their soul. They were trying to recover. And we need to give kids an opportunity to do that. Okay, so now we're finally there. And we get to talk about the practical strategies for doing something that can help ameliorate these kinds of issues. Let's start. Oops, hit the wrong button, sorry. If a child has to have a cell phone, and a lot of children think they do now, give them a dumb one instead of a smart one. Because most younger children, they make the argument, I have to get in touch with you, I have to be able to call you. What happens after sports or music or whatever is over, I need to be able to get, well, okay, fine, here's a phone that allows you to make telephone calls. Novel idea. And maybe even allows them to text. But it doesn't give them the opportunity to dive into that phone as a means of just becoming absorbed in that symbolic world. When they bring it home at night, when they don't need to call you, they put it on the kitchen counter and they leave it there. And they don't touch it again until the next day. Unless someone calls them, and then they can answer the phone and stand there while you listen in on the conversation. Right? Designate bedrooms as no-tech zones. Now, I want to reassure you, these are things that people have told me that they've used and worked. I'm not saying this is what you have to go do. Every situation is different, every child is different, every family is different, every environment is different, and you got to figure this out essentially for yourself. So what I'm saying here are some strategies that I know have worked for some people. Use them as you see fit. But bedrooms can be that sacred place where kids can retreat to. It's also a good place to sleep. Designate no-tech times, meals, homework, etc. There's actually a pretty good advertisement on TV. You might have seen it where mom comes in and everybody's sitting around the dining room table talking on their phones or looking into their phones, and she hits a button and the internet goes off. The Wi-Fi turns on, right? It's actually a terrible commercial in the sense that it teaches us that for every problem, no matter how human, there's a technical solution. Right? It would be much better if she came in and said, look folks, we're putting them down, we're all going to sit around the table, we're going to talk today. And that's the way it's going to be, period. I have to tell you this, the 4 students in that class I talked about, the media studies class, I ran into one of them the next semester, and we started talking, and she said, I got to tell you this, there are 4 of us who eat together because we have the same class before lunch, and we go in the cafeteria and we take one of these great big tables that 7 people can sit around, and we all throw our cell phones into the middle of the table, and anybody who sits down with us has to do the same thing. I said, hey, that's a great idea. She says, you know what's even greater? There are now 3 more tables that are doing the same thing. Small victories, right, that you hope for with your people that we work with. Watch important TV together and talk about what you see. There's a lot of things that are on television that might be educational, they might be important for kids to see, but they still might have some pretty gruesome stuff in it, some stuff in it that you don't want the kids to see necessarily. Well, the good news is that the research that's been done on television, and there's a lot of research on television from a lot of years, all of it indicates that most of the ill effects of children being exposed to violence on television are ameliorated and basically offset when a parent is sitting with the child and discusses what the child sees. Those problems seem to go away. Now, that doesn't mean that you should just say, okay, kids, we're all going to watch this gory movie together. But it does mean that there are some ways that you can help the damage. Model the behavior you want from your children. And I try to get real close to the door when I because, yeah, it makes some demands. We all know that children think what we do is okay. And when we do something, they want to do it too. And so if you don't want your children to be talking on the cell phone at the dinner table, when you want to talk to them, don't be talking on the cell phone when you drive them to and from school. If you don't want them to play video games, don't play video games yourself. These are things that we have to sacrifice for the welfare of our kids. And we have to make those conscious decisions that we're going to model with these mental tools what we want behavior from our kids, just like we do with physical tools. Last one, establish regular technology fasts when all digital and screen technology is turned off for a day. Now, I put this in there primarily because it allows me to talk about that group of students one more time, because we're not quite done with their story. Those students that I had in that media class, and this is the final thing that I want to say about it. Those students got so agitated about their frustrations with their cell phones that when I asked them, about turning them off and they couldn't get away from them, I got agitated. And I did a really impulsive thing. I told them to take out all of their electronic equipment out of their purses and their pants and put them on the table that was in front of them and go outside and find some place where you can't communicate with anybody else and just sit there for 20 minutes and don't do anything. And they looked at me like I was crazy, but since they're first year students, I'm God, so they did what I told them to do. And they went on out there. I panicked immediately, wondering if they'd come back, and then I realized I was holding their cell phones. So of course they came back in 20 minutes. And the only thing I feared was that they'd say it's a huge waste of time. And no one said that. The vast majority of the students in that class actually expressed appreciation that I made them do something they couldn't do on their own. And they talked about how important it was to be able to do this again, as if they had done it at one time but given it up. One of the students said this is the first time since 9th grade, when he got his first cell phone, that he actually felt like he was alone. That's pretty sad. Several of the students talked about getting in touch with themselves again for the first time in a long time. And a lot of them said, what a great rest it was to not feel like they just had to get in touch with somebody. So I felt pretty good about that. And I thought, well, again, they might be conning me about this. But then at the end of well, they asked me if they could continue doing this. And they talked me in, it was a 90-minute class twice a week, so I figured we have some time. So I said, okay, I'll give you 15 minutes. So for the rest of the semester, twice a week, those kids would come in, they'd drop off their stuff, and outside they'd go. And the only time they didn't do it was when it was raining and snowing. Didn't matter how cold it was, we agreed they were going outside. No one complained, everyone did it. And like I say, I'm still worried that they were conning me just to get out 15 minutes out of class, right? But then at the end of the semester, I did what I do in all my classes. I asked them, what is the best and worst part of your experience in this class? First person that held up her hand said, those 15 minutes of solitude, that's what we came to call it, 15 minutes of solitude. Those 15 minutes of solitude is the best thing I did all semester. And my stupid response was, well, that doesn't say much about the content of the course, does it? And she said, wait, no, Dr. Monke, that's not what I meant at all. What I meant was, of all of the things that I've done here at Wittenberg this semester, that was the best thing I did. And a whole bunch of the kids in the class nodded their heads. And everyone agreed that this is something that they ought to do more of on their own. I don't think many of them did. But at least at the time, I felt pretty happy about finding something like this. And then, when they left class, I got sad. Actually, a little depressed. Because it dawned on me that here were a bunch of kids who needed permission to take 30 minutes a week out of their time in order to be alone, to be by themselves, to reconnect with who they really are, right? So, I think that's what our kids need from us today more than anything. They don't need more devices to connect to faraway places, certainly. And what they need is for us to insist that they take time to reconnect with their own inner selves, to rest their overwhelmed spirits, and to repair their damaged souls. So if you do nothing tonight when you leave here except this, I hope you'll go home and make sure that your children have some kind of sacred place that they can go to recover from this tremendous din and demands of the digitized world, and where they can actually rediscover their childhood. And that's all I have to say. And I see that I took way too long. Comments, corrections, questions? Anyone have anything to say about any of this? I'm open to criticism. Please. Yes.
I will say something. There's a commercial on now that, where the kids are telling the parents to get off their phones. So
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody else is.
That's local.
Yeah. Oh, is that?
Yeah, that's local. These kids are they from Denver? Boulder? I'm not sure. Yeah, that was on the local news page. That they're taking a holiday from their cell phones. Mm-hmm.
Is there sort of like a divide between like how you can sort of like experience compassion through TV to see an event and sort of feel something, but then to sort of like feel it in real life? Because some people say that literature and film have sort of gained a lot of compassion for humanity, in a sense that you can feel what another person is feeling. But is there still a divide there because it's still not actually like feeling those feelings?
It's really difficult to experience an emotion through any kind of representation that you haven't experienced in real life, with some kind of real experience. I'm not saying that you can't experience compassion, all these other things, when you read a book or watch a movie or something like that. We all I will confess, I cry a lot when I watch movies, right? But that's predicated on the fact that you've had experiences to which that experience or that watching the movie connects. So you're drawing on your past experience to connect you to experience someone else is showing on the screen. And that's how we become engrossed in a movie, I think. That's how we become so lit up by some experience we see on the screen, because somehow it taps into something that we have knowledge of firsthand. That makes sense? It's a really good question. Yes?
I was pleased to hear that the students had found respite in the 20 or 15 minutes. I'm curious if and how many shared anxiety about that experience based on those true things around literal addictions to not kind of knowing where it is or feeling that.
This was mostly boys that came back in and said for 5 minutes or so, they were really antsy. They were really kind of agitated out there. And what seemed, at least in most of the cases, of course this isn't true for everybody, and my memory's a little foggy on some of these things, but it seemed that what really helped was the fact that they were sitting under trees. They were out in nature. It was a beautiful day, thank God. But they were out there, and one of the things that they talked about a lot is that they were watching bugs. They were watching people walk through. They were all in this commons area of Wittenberg. It's a small campus. They were watching people walk through from a distance. There were things that they were paying attention to. They weren't just sitting there, meditating. Most of them were watching things, looking at things. And what is, I think essentially the common sense was that the world slowed down. And for some of them, slowing down the world was a little bit disconcerting. But then it didn't take long. It didn't. I was really surprised. The first was 20 minutes. And some of them said they got really sleepy at first, but something caught their attention and then they were okay with it. But what was astounding is how little they had done any of that. And it was such a unique experience. I mean, I just do that. I could do that my whole life, actually. Sit under a tree on a nice day. It was so new that I think it really captured their interest. And it surprised me. I didn't think it was that severe, that kind of deprivation of connection with the real world. Anything else?
I'll just share something real quick and then kind of a question. With the dumb phone, the peer pressure to go from a dumb phone to a smartphone, not only did it affect the children, but when I would come into school, it seems like their classmates would attack me for not having my child on a smartphone. So the peer pressure is amazing. That aspect of things.
Not just peer pressure.
Yeah, it's peer pressure, and then and you see these kids, I'll say, grow up. You're part of. You see them from first grade or kindergarten on, so they're comfortable giving you a hard time that your kid is on a smartphone. So that's been our hardest battle, actually, with that. It's with the smartphone side of things. And then when is it time to introduce them into the smartphone? Because my children are 8th and sophomore high school.
Yeah.
And so when is the time to introduce them to the smartphone?
I don't know. I mean, again, circumstances in a family, in a child's life. What's a child ready for? How mature are they? My boys shouldn't have had a cell phone until they were out of college. I mean, mature, right? But there is some judgment there, right? But I'd say in a broad range, the first time that they ought to get a cell phone is not for social reasons, but for safety reasons, or for connection reasons with parents. And they use that as sort of a training wheels approach, right? Say, okay, we can get you a cell phone, but you gotta communicate with us. This is about us because you gotta learn how to use it properly. And then you graduate.
Hold on to it.
Yeah, don't lose it. My oldest son lost 7 cell phones by the time he got out of the house. You're responsible, right? He wasn't ready for something. So, yeah, this is what you have to do, I think, is make these judgments yourself. But resisting peer pressure is just horrible for a parent, I know. I don't know what to tell you about that, other than you make some compromises. You do make some compromises. And I know I'm probably having these teachers, they've heard this before, but my youngest son got his first cell phone from his girlfriend's grandmother. She bought him the cell phone because we wouldn't get him one. And then what am I supposed to do? You know, it's a grandmother for crying out loud. Now that's pressure too. So we get it from all different ways. And the best I can tell you is you act out of love, you do what you think is right, you make compromises so that the results of your refusal are not worse than the results of your allowing them to do this. I think this is decisions we make all the time, right? That there are sometimes we know we're not doing what we should in the best of all worlds do for our children, but it would cause so much trauma and animosity that it's not worth it. And we give in a little bit. But always extract something from them in return, right, if you can. I guess that's the way I would look at it.
Have you ever heard of a middle school or high school that has like a docking station kind of concept where when they come to school they just dock it and pick it up at the end of the day?
Yeah, there was the Waldorf School in Washington that I worked with for 7 years. They came up, they probably got it from somebody else, but yeah, big, actually several boxes made out of wood. Of course, the Waldorf School is got a little artistically made, and just lots of slots in it. And the kids come to school, they find their slot, and they put their cell phone in it. No big deal. They get out of the car or off the bus or whatever. There it is. They put it in. They walk into school. They pick it up when they leave. It's a really good thing to do.
You know, I think just building on that idea as a concept. So we're digital non-natives, but we're raising digital natives is a way to think about that. But we are still the adults, and I think we need to set the precedence how we use these things and not allow them to dictate how things are used, because they intuitively know how to use these things, right? So I think that's a really strong point is we are still the adults.
Yeah.
We need to model and show
Yeah.
younger people how to work with these things.
Yeah, there are some things that aren't that different. I mean, I wanted to use the car one way. My parents wanted me to use the car the other way. And most of the time they won, right? They said, this is how you're going to use it. And it's part of the parents' job to set the limits. And it's true of digital technology as everything else. And we've had peer pressure forever. And I think it's far more intense now than it used to be, but there are still some things that we've done in the past that deal with peer pressure that we would draw on again. Because that's part of being a parent. I don't think you can get away from it. Anything else? I've worn you out. Oh, yes.
So I'm thinking that technology dominance is requiring some other problems. I mean, you sort of how important it is to get out in nature, how important it is to have unsupervised play, how important it is to daydream, and I agree with those things. So and when people say it was so great to just have a break, a 20-minute break, I'm wondering if part of what feels good about it is you're getting away from these other things, the supervision. There's so much to learn. It's so competitive. If you want to do well, materially, which, there's a big push to do, have it do very well in the material realm, and taking a break from that, not just from technology, I would say is also.
Yeah, I probably overstate the correlation between what those kids did and the technology that's involved, because these kids were under enormous pressure in lots of ways, like you said, especially being first-year students, just getting there. They're overwhelmed in all kinds of ways, right? And I think kids are overwhelmed in all kinds of ways in general these days, far more than certainly my generation was, and probably their parents' generation. And this is a piece of it, but it's not the whole thing. You're right, pressure to get a 4.0 for high school, because that's the only way you can get to a good college, right? Pressures to do all kinds of things really well. I did interviews at Wittenberg for kids who were coming in and to get scholarships. And they were studying for interviews, for crying out loud. It's awful, the kinds of pressure these kids are in. And they were doing community service for the sole reason of getting it on their applications. And that's just wrong. But it's so much pressure to do things that are against the grain of our kids now. And technology is a piece of that. We have really created an environment that causes our kids to be sick and to be ill, I think. And that's our fault. It's not their fault, and it's our problem. We've got to do a lot of things to solve that. I work with the technology piece of it, but there are all kinds of other things that we do to our children that are wrong and cause them to be under enormous stress. And we need to stop that. I'm glad you brought that up. It's absolutely true.
So I just want to step in for just a second here. Childcare is closing at 7:30. And so those that we have brought in to do childcare will be leaving. So if you have children now, they won't be your children.
Thank you. Yes, you're welcome. One more question, then we'll wrap up.
Well, I think one of the major issues though is that, it unintentionally kind of builds up a stress as well, because if the issue is that they need to be connected with their friends 24/7, that means that they're socializing essentially 24/7. I think that's essentially, you're overworking yourself at that point.
Yeah, there's lots of research that shows that young people these days aren't getting nearly enough sleep. And one of the big culprits is that they're texting at night. And their ears are now attuned to the noise that their cell phone makes. When they get a text message, it wakes them up. They break their sleep pattern, and then they don't get back to sleep right away, and it's a vicious cycle. And our kids are just enormously tired.
Well, it's also what is it? You can't keep consistently, following a schedule if you're having, if you're socializing all that much, because sometimes you'll be in more intense social situations and stuff like that, and that can keep you up all night for certain people. So I think the issue, with people, it can be a really kind of distracting thing, I guess. And it's really overworking your body, I think.
Yeah, and your mind.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming, having patience to listen to all of this. And go get them.